Okay, welcome everybody. This is my video for the Ask Me Anything uh, forum or thread, whatever terminology you crazy kids use these days. And what I'm going to do is I will just go through and answer questions as they were ranked for 1 hour. And it's not that I'm selfish with my time and don't want to give you more of my time, but I think if I go past an hour, some people might say, you know what, I don't need to waste my life listening to this guy. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I reserve the right to perhaps skip some questions, but I was glancing through this before I started recording the video, and I think there was nothing too personal. No one asked me about my three felonious enterprises. Okay, Cole Running says, what empirical evidence do you think would finally settle the dispute between Keynes and Hayek? Well, my answer is pretty easy. There is no such empirical evidence. I don't think it could be done, at least realistically. Um, I understand I sound like an obnoxious Austrian ideologue by saying this, but to me, what more evidence could you need to see that Keynesian remedies actually make things worse, right? That when if you look at it and say, well, gee, when in history did we get the most Keynesian medicine? It was in the 1930s and in the most recent crisis, and the economy got worse after they applied it. Now, admittedly, a Keynesian, someone who on theoretical grounds believes in Keynesian remedies, is going to say, what are you kidding me? That's like saying hospitals make people sick, because if you look empirically, it seems like people in hospitals are sicker than people who aren't in hospitals, right? So I understand there's that issue of causality versus correlation, but I'm just saying uh, the evidence to me seems overwhelmingly in favor of the proposition that it doesn't make the economy recover more quickly when the government takes resources and diverts them to political ends, as opposed to what they would have done if they had been left in the private sector. There are many examples of so-called austerity being tried and working, in the sense that governments cut their spending or at least significantly slowed the rate of increase, and then uh, even if they were in the midst of a severe recession, and then a year later they were doing fine. And Krugman, for example, will go through the list of those, and for each one, he can come up with some particular reason. It's not always the same reason. He always comes up with some particular reason. He's like, oh, well, that example doesn't count because the central bank cut interest rates during that same period. So that's not a story about austerity working. That's a story about monetary policy offsetting the contractionary effects of fiscal policy. And then another, oh, well, that one, well, their currency weakened, and so they were able to export more. So that's not a story about austerity working. That's a story about export growth. And the world as a whole can export more to Martians, so that doesn't count. So I'm saying there's so many moving parts and so many different variables going on when we talk about macroeconomics. If you already believe going into it that austerity will make the economy worse, but it could be offset by other factors, well, then you're always going to be able to look at the data on any particular episode and say, oh yeah, that's not a story of austerity working, that's something else doing that, right? Just like you might say with the Obama stimulus package, what would the data have to look like for people to conclude, ooh, that stimulus made things worse, besides having the so-called consensus forecasts of how the economy was going to do even with no stimulus, and then having the economy with the stimulus doing worse than that, right? You would think that would be an open and shut case, and that at the very least, the Keynesians would say, okay, yeah, that's admittedly embarrassing, but that doesn't really disprove our theory. It's just the economy was worse than we thought. Okay, no, but instead the Keynesians were trumpeting it and saying, "See, look at how many jobs we saved," and these forecasting firms can calculate how many jobs we saved or created. So the stimulus clearly worked. That's my point. Is that things that at least you would expect the Keynesians to say, okay, you're right, that's prima facie evidence against us, but we still believe on theoretical grounds that and this was overrun, there's noise in the data, or there were other effects that masked the help that our stimulus, but they typically don't say that. They just say, yeah, see how right we are? Just to give you an example, in the summer, I believe, of 2009, Krugman had I don't know if it was a blog post or I think it might have even been an op-ed saying something like, big government saves the day or something like that. And there he was saying that, okay, we're through the worst of it now, because at that point it looked like officially the U.S. was turning the corner, at least in terms of total output, and that the recession was coming to an end. I mean, the unemployment picture was still bad, but that it looked like real GDP was no longer contracting at that point. And so he was saying, so what do we have to thank for? Well, basically big government. And I'm not putting words in his mouth. Krugman literally used the phrase big government and said that's why things didn't get as bad this time around as they did in the early 30s. Right? So, but then whenever anything isn't good, in terms of like the lingering unemployment or the fact that the economy is still pretty bad years later, what does Krugman say? He said, well, I told you guys in the beginning. I told you in January of 2009 that the Obama administration wasn't spending enough, that the stimulus needed to be bigger, right? So Krugman's walking around thinking he's been totally vindicated, and yet that's an odd, way of threading the needle, that he's saying because the economy didn't get as bad as the Great Depression, that just proves to you how effective that stimulus was, but because the economy is still really awful, that just proves to you that the stimulus wasn't big enough, and he's walking around like he called it, like he's, Nostradamus or something. So I'm just saying it's, an Austrian could come around and do quite a similar thing. And I could say as an Austrian, well, okay, yeah, the economy's worse now. It's really bad because we had the second biggest government intervention in U.S. history. Okay, why isn't the economy as awful as it was in the 1930s? Well, we haven't literally had the New Deal, right? Obama thankfully got pushed back by the forces of the Tea Party and didn't completely socialize healthcare and didn't do cap and trade and all the other stuff that he was planning on doing when he first came into office, and people were calling him the next FDR. Thank goodness he got pushed back and only could do 1/4 of the stuff he wanted to. And so that's why the economy right now is awful, but it's not as bad as it was back during the 30s. You see what I mean? So it's you have so much room to play with because we don't have controlled experiments. Okay, why don't I move on? I mean, I'm not trying to be completely pessimistic or cynical. I mean, I think there is on the margin, I think there are economists who are on the fence and who theoretically don't have a strong view one way or the other and aren't committed to the efficacy of government stimulus plans, or actually just more broadly, they aren't committed one way or the other to the proposition that a market economy can get stuck in a rut because of insufficient aggregate demand, leaving scope for helpful intervention either by the monetary authorities or by the Treasury in terms of running a fiscal deficit. I think there are a lot of economists who really don't have a strong feeling one way or the other, and perhaps they would be interested to look at empirical studies measuring, the multipliers and things. But I'm saying even there, and again, I'm not that I'm an expert or anything or that I've gotten hip deep into the literature, but my cursory examination, in particular, me reading Krugman defending stuff, typically what happens is there aren't any episodes where the multiplier actually is big. For example, you might say, no, but what about World War II? Well, no. Robert Barrow did an econometric study of what the multiplier would have been during the war years in World War II, and he found it was pretty low. And so Krugman, to respond to that, didn't say, no, you did the econometrics wrong, Barrow. No, Krugman said, well, there was rationing during World War II, you idiot. Can you guys believe this? That these idiot disbelievers in Keynes are going to be so silly as to think that we ever claimed that the measured multiplier would be high during World War II? When in fact, what are you talking about, Krugman? Krugman, on popular television shows, when people ask him, would stimulus work, or do we have historical examples? He said, yeah, there was a jobs program called World War II. What better evidence do you need of the government jump-starting an economy out of a depression than the massive deficits of World War II? Now, purists might hear me saying that and pounce and get real specific and parse what I'm saying and say, oh, no, there's no contradiction there. There's a difference between the measured multiplier in terms of consumption expenditures and so forth, or GDP, I should say, versus what happened to the unemployment rate, and Krugman was being totally okay, fine. But my point is, when you're doing things like saying, let's just historically look at the multiplier effect and you go to assess it, my understanding is there are plenty of reputable studies saying it's not that big. And again, it depends what episode you include and so on. And the way Keynesians respond to that I've typically seen, is that in cases where prima facie you would think, holy cow, that should have been a huge example of a big measured multiplier, and it's not, such as World War II, the Keynesians will say, well, yeah, but they had rationing. So like the multiplier wasn't allowed to work its magic. Or I've seen other Keynesians come back and in responding to a study that looked at several different episodes and then lumped them together and came up with a number for what's the multiplier. And I've seen Keynesians come back and say, oh, wait a minute, but you shouldn't have included these 3 different examples in there because, even on theoretical grounds, nobody would have expected the Keynesian multiplier to show up there. So my point is, to me, it seems like there's lots of empirical evidence in favor of the proposition that to me seems pretty straightforward, that the economy is not helped by the government wasting resources, and there's not very much evidence in favor of that proposition. That typically what happens when you ask a Keynesian, point to me episodes where stimulus spending was a success, usually what they will do is point to economies that are awful and just say, but imagine how bad they would have been in the absence of the stimulus. So for example, Christina Romer and Paul Krugman, they point to the period between 1933 and 1937 as wonderful vindication of the success of FDR's big deficits. But it's not like the U.S. economy from 33 to 37 was a great model of excellence, right? I mean, the unemployment rate was huge, and you could say, yeah, the official rate of increase of GDP was big, but it was starting from a pretty depressed level, and it's not clear what it would have looked like. And so in absolute terms, nobody in the year 1936 was thinking in the U.S., wow, this is a wonderful economy. They may have been thinking this is a lot better than it was in 33, but it wasn't like they were out of the woods in 1936, right? And the same thing, they will point to the Obama stimulus package and say, oh, well, that clearly was good. It was inadequate, it should have been bigger, but it really did avert catastrophe. And so they're pointing to the U.S. or other places around the world. Again, Paul Krugman saying big government saved the day as vindication, when no, the world economy and the U.S. economy in particular was awful in 2009 and 2010. And so to claim vindication, they have to say, well, it's because we're engaging in a counterfactual and we think it would have been 1932 again had the government done nothing. Whereas in contrast, when I say there's plenty of evidence of austerity working, I don't mean, oh, there's plenty of countries where they were going down the tubes and the government cut spending, and then, yeah, it was still awful for 3 years, but then finally they crawled out. But I think it would have been even worse had they continued with their big deficit spending. No, that's not what I mean. I'm saying the economy truly rebounded, that it was out of recession by anybody's definition, so let's say 18 months after the austerity was implemented, and then things were fine. They just, they hit rock bottom, and boom, they recovered, just like the people pushing austerity say would happen. And then, the Keynesians just explain that stuff away by saying, oh, it was because of something else, that the austerity per se made them worse, but that was more than counterbalanced by other things like the central bank loosening or exports increasing or whatever. All right, so on any particular episode, you really don't have enough information to make a conclusion one way or the other because there are so many different confounding variables, 18 different moving parts. I wouldn't expect a Keynesian to give up his position on any one of those. But my point is, there are dozens of cases that ostensibly show the success of austerity, and the Keynesian has to explain each one away. And there aren't really any clear-cut examples of massive deficit spending pulling an economy quickly out of recession. That usually what they do is, the Keynesian will always say, oh, well, yeah, I mean, there was a banking crisis, and we all know from history that it'll take years to unwind, and so, we shouldn't expect any miracles from this stuff. So when you ask, what empirical evidence would finally settle the dispute, I don't think there is any. Okay, Renegade Division asks me, what do you think about Bitcoins? I, for a long time, have been intending to write an article on that, and so I will try to be brief on this particular answer because I really do think that that article is going to come out soon. Uh, I'm I'm sort of agnostic as to whether they will uh, sweep through. The fact that they were kind of hot about 8 months ago, and now I really haven't heard much about them. If I have to guess, I would say they're probably not going to explode and be the next big thing. But that, I mean, I'm not good at catching fads, as anyone who looks at my wardrobe can attest. So don't misquote me. I'm not going on record here. Bob Murphy says Bitcoin a failure. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if you're forcing me to guess, it was really hot a while ago, and so with something like Bitcoin, where it only really works if a lot of people adopt it, it seemed like it had its chance to really take off, and it didn't. So I mean, it might get another bite at the apple, but that is kind of concerning if you were a big proponent of Bitcoin, that it was it looked like it was really cool and was catching on for a while in certain circles, and then it kind of hit a wall, and um, I think is staggering. I don't have the latest figures as to how many people use it and so forth, but my understanding is it hasn't really been growing. As far as people who are interested in Austrian economics are concerned, the big thing with Bitcoin is the question: does that in any way embarrass or invalidate Ludwig von Mises' famous regression theorem? So just let me be very brief. I don't want to make this too technical. So for those who don't know, Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, one of his contributions to economic theory was to explain uh, where he took subjective value theory and he successfully applied it to the case of money, whereas the earlier economists hadn't really done it very successfully. So they used subjective value theory that was pioneered in the early 1870s. They applied that very successfully to basically a barter economy, and so you could explain the equilibrium exchange rate between apples and oranges, or between labor and horses, or whatever, in terms of assuming people have subjective ordinal preference rankings, and then there's various principles to figure out what the prices will be. Incidentally, if you're interested in that, at Mises.org, within, I think it came out in either late January or February of 2012, if people are watching this in a time capsule, Daniel Sanchez has a good article called something like "The Mystery of Marginal Pears," and that walks through the Austrian analysis of how prices are formed in a barter situation. So if you actually are curious and want to go look up, it's a pretty one of the pithiest explanations I've seen of that. But anyway, so Mises took that analysis and he applied it to money. And because of our time constraints, I'm not going to go into why that was a stumbling block, but it took Mises to do it. That the earlier economists who saw how you use subjective value theory in a barter situation, they thought it didn't work with money. But Mises applied it to money, and what ended up happening is he had to introduce the time element. That he had to say, the reason you are willing to accept the money commodity in exchange for your labor today, or in exchange for whatever you're selling today, is that you think it's going to have purchasing power tomorrow. But how do you know that? Where do you get that from? Well, because you in the recent past, let's say yesterday, observed its purchasing power. Okay, so Mises avoided the circularity argument, because what happened is before the economists were saying, oh, wait a minute, the reason you can't say you value money because of what it will buy, because that's what we're trying to explain. Because they thought they were just moving in a circle, saying, oh, the reason you can buy stuff with money is because you can buy stuff with money. And so you see how that sounds like you're just going in a circle. So Mises broke it up. He said, no, it's not a circular argument. Today, the reason money has purchasing power is that you expect it will have purchasing power tomorrow. And then why today do you think that? Because yesterday you saw that it had purchasing power. So you see, that's not moving in a circle. But now it looks like we have a new problem. It looks like now there's an infinite regress. It looks like we're basically explaining the purchasing power of money today by reference to its purchasing power yesterday. So you say, okay, well, that just begs the question, Mises, where did the purchasing power of money come from yesterday? And then he would say, oh, the day before yesterday. And it looks like, oh, you can't stop. And that's where he comes in with this regression theorem. He's saying, yes, you can stop, that I haven't set up an infinite regress. You can trace back the purchasing power of the monetary commodity, one day before, all the way until it was just a regular commodity. So if you're talking about gold, there was a point that we can logically imagine when there was no money and everything was barter, and there would be gold. And so people valued gold at that time, not because it was money, not because it had purchasing power, but just because it was pretty and whatever else you do with gold, for reasons that people valued gold before it served as a medium of exchange. All right, so that's what the regression theorem says, that you can explain the purchasing power of money today, if you're talking about a commodity money, by at least logically, not that you would actually go do historical analysis, but just theoretically, logically, you could say, oh, it's coherent for me to attribute its purchasing power today to what it had yesterday. It's not that it's the same, but it's that you have some way to frame what its purchasing power would be because you saw what it actually was in fact yesterday. Right? So it's not that what it was yesterday pins down what it has to be today, but the point is it gives you a frame of reference. So you have a starting point to then do whatever you're going to do with your expectations. And it gets traced back. So even with fiat money, like you say, well, wait a minute, what about the US dollar today or the euro today? That was never a regular commodity in the marketplace because it's fiat money. Yeah, but even there, you can trace it back to when the dollar was redeemable for gold or silver. Where the euro, when they first introduced it, it exchanged for so many lira and francs and Deutschmarks and so forth, or I guess marks, right? So, which in turn had historical ties to gold or silver. Okay, so there the point is, modern Austrians, when they invoke the regression theorem, what they have in mind is that for something to be money right now, there has to be this historical link to perhaps going through several different types of goods, but ultimately going back to when something was grounded as a regular commodity in the marketplace, where we can explain its exchange value based on regular old sort of barter economics. All right. So if that's your context, Bitcoin comes along, and that a lot of Austrian economists just rejected it out of hand, and they said that no, Bitcoin can't possibly ever turn into money, which means it's a medium of exchange that's accepted by just about everybody in the community. They were rejecting it, almost on principle, and saying that can't ever work. It can't possibly work because Bitcoin, by its very nature, is sort of this abstract mathematical thing, and it's not like gold, where gold is useful for other things, and then it could also be adopted as a medium of exchange. With Bitcoin, it just, what is that? It's not like that was. It's not like the Bitcoins were doing something else, and then we adopted them to start using them as money. They were expressly designed to be money, ostensibly to be like a perfect money in several respects, right? The government can't inflate it and so on. That is very secure from certain points of view. So, that on the one hand, there were lots of people in the libertarian community who just were completely enamored with the idea of Bitcoin because it looked like, aha, we use this thing, and no matter how many guns they have or how many supercomputers they have, the government can't touch our money if we use Bitcoin. But on the other hand, the more academic, not the people who are out risking going to jail, but the sort of tenured professors sitting around saying, it would be good if the government left people alone, but I'm not going to shake the boat too much. Those types were more thinking this can't possibly be money, right? Because it would violate the regression theorem. All right, so let me wrap this particular tangent up. I'm going way too long on this point. So where do I come down on that issue? Well, let me try to be slippery and not give a firm answer, but let me just give a conditional answer. I have seen some Austrians say things that are overstepping, I believe. I've seen some Austrians say something like, Bitcoin could never possibly become a money because it was never tied to a real commodity, and that would violate the regression theorem. And so, according to, if Mises is right, Bitcoin can't be money. And I think that's dangerous because you just basically blew up Mises. Because if you really push through the logic of the regression theorem, it's not just that a good, in order to be money, had to have a historical link to a just a regular commodity, but for a good to be a medium of exchange, it has to have that. All right, so in the Austrian theory or framework, a medium of exchange just means an item that you accept and trade because you're going to trade it away for something else. So money is a medium of exchange. It's just a special type of medium of exchange that happens to be acceptable to everybody in the community. But you can imagine something that's a medium of exchange that's not money because not everybody in the community accepts it. So what I'm saying is Bitcoin already is a medium of exchange. There are people in the world right now who will sell something valuable, let's say online, they'll sell their Don Mattingly rookie card for Bitcoins and then trade away the Bitcoins for some other valuable thing. And the whole time they knew that's what they were going to do with it, right? So for those people, Bitcoin already is a medium of exchange. It's not that it might become one in the future. It is right now. And so even though typically we frame the discussion of the regression theorem in terms of money, I think really the inner logic of it would also apply just to any medium of exchange. And so if you're going to take the hardcore position that if Bitcoin ever empirically became money, that would blow up Ludwig von Mises, and then that's why you kind of think Bitcoin won't because you're so sure Mises is right. Well, unfortunately, I think you already just killed Mises because really the logic of the position you are attributing to him would say if something ever became a medium of exchange, then it ought to have that link. Okay, so, but now that's a different question. Now another question is, did Mises actually hold that strong view, right? So those people who are trying to say it's either Bitcoin or Mises, you have to choose, are they right to set up that dichotomy? And that's a more nuanced question. In the theory of money and credit, I don't think Mises said something that strong, right? I think so clearly there when Mises is explaining how is it that gold, how is it that we explain gold's purchasing power, he, told you to walk back mentally to the point at which gold was just a regular commodity. But I don't know that anywhere in that particular book Mises came out and said, and for all future media of exchange that we can logically imagine, this must also be the case. All right, I think he was more just saying, in the case of monies that we have experienced so far on Earth, this is true. I don't know that he went out on a limb and said, and by the way, I'm going to lay down a law saying for the rest of human history, no exceptions to this can ever occur, even in principle. I don't know what I'm saying. However, David Gordon, I asked this on the Mises list one time for clarification on this issue, and David Gordon passed along a citation. There is at least one passage in Human Action where Mises he comes pretty close to saying explicitly the only way something can become a money is if it at one time was linked to a regular commodity. So if you are an Austrian economist, a fan of Mises, and you also are a fan of Bitcoin, you can either just say, well, Mises was wrong on that, he should have been a little bit more modest, or you can say Bitcoin really is a commodity because if you think through, and so this, it's up to you if you want to go this route. If you think through, how is it that Bitcoin even got off the ground, right? Because you could have invented all sorts of things that were like Bitcoin, right? I could have just been walking around saying, "Hey, I'm thinking of a number. How much will you pay me for it?" Or, what will you sell me in exchange for the number I'm thinking of today? And I'm going to keep doing that. I mean, that wouldn't get off the ground. Nobody would trade me valuable goods for random numbers that I'm generating in my head. All right. So what was the appeal of Bitcoin? I think it was undeniably the fact that a lot of people recognized, whoa, if we could just get 1 million people around the world using this thing as a medium of exchange, on a regular basis, that would really give us a nucleus of an economic network that was really impervious to government monetary mischief, right? So I think that's why a lot of people up front really were throwing their weight behind Bitcoin and were trying to get it off the ground, and why, and then also some of them just as pure speculators may have said, you know what, this thing is so cheap right now. Because in the beginning, I don't remember the exact numbers, but in the beginning, I mean, I think for $1, you could have bought a lot of Bitcoin in terms of the number of units. So I could see a lot of people saying, this thing conceivably could take off the ground, could really shoot, could really take off. And so, yeah, I'll put down $10 or I'll put down $100 just on the off chance that it takes off, and boom, I make them, and then I'm a millionaire. So, so there, I mean, that's kind of an interesting twist. That, in other words, what would it mean to say that Bitcoin actually was a commodity that was valued for its own sake beyond its role as a medium of exchange? You could make the argument that, well, the reason it initially was valued was because of its ideological appeal, or because people looked at it as an investment vehicle, not as a medium of exchange. All right, so there's various ways you could try to rescue the regression theorem if you thought prima facie there was rescuing that needed to occur. Okay, I spent way too much time on that one. Let me move along here. What's your opinion on the Cato Institute and the Hoover Institution? I know a lot of good scholars who are involved with both. I mean, I don't know what the person wants me to go with this. I mean, certainly people who, how can I put it? There's different schools of thought as to how one should conduct himself in terms of his career, or how an institution should position itself in terms of the public debate. So people who think it's better to really be pure and to state what you think the truth is and not care about fitting in with everybody else, then you're going to be a bigger fan of the Independent Institute or the Mises Institute. Whereas other people think, oh, come on, as long as what you're saying is way out of the realm of the standard political discourse in the right direction, but you're, using some of the terminology and you're trying not to sound like you're a nut job with, aluminum foil headgear and so on, then you're going to like the Cato Institute or the Hoover Institution, right? So I will say, like, for example, the Heritage Foundation also touts itself as a free market institution, but I actually think the Heritage Foundation just makes way too many concessions, at least on many areas, right? So, I mean, I do know some people working for the Heritage Foundation that are really good free market people, but I'm just saying institutionally, I think the Cato Institute is a lot more of a hardcore free market place than like the Heritage Foundation. The Hoover Institution, I'm not as familiar with them in terms of their overall presence on the scene in terms of American political and economic discourse. Like, I know a few big guns who are affiliated with it. I think they're good, but I don't really have a feel for just in general. Like, if somebody writes an op-ed and I see, without seeing the name, oh, it's from somebody who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, that doesn't really mean anything to me. That doesn't like make me think one thing one way or the other. Whereas if I saw it was someone for the Cato Institute, I would probably think, especially if it's on some matter of economic policy per se, as opposed to like foreign policy or something, that, yeah, I'm probably going to like what this person has to say, or at least whatever the reasoning is in favor of the policy, I'll probably agree with those reasons, and just maybe I'll think the person's leaving out something important that trumps what he's talking about, if it's somebody from the Cato Institute. So I don't, like I say, I'm not sure what more you wanted me to say about that. Okay, Blazing Truth says, hi, I'm an ANCAP engineer who wants to completely phase out NASA. and let the private industry go to work. Could you give a brief reply to the common objection, quote, but without NASA, there would be no, and then he's got a blank, and then with the parentheses, Apollo missions, internet, etc. There should be an end quotes there, but there's not. So technically, everything else in this thread is in this guy's quotation marks, and the universe blows up. We'll add that in there. Okay, so now I guess he's talking in. Essentially, how do Austro-libertarians deal with high barriers to entry? Okay, well, I have written on this in several places. Those of you who don't have my book, really, you're just, what reason is there for you to continue living? My politically incorrect guide to capitalism. In all seriousness, if you're sort of liking the answers I'm giving here and you haven't read that book, I would recommend that you get it. My bank balance will thank you for it, because it does. I do explain this. So there, this kind of question is the sort of thing I tackle in that book, and I do all kinds of things like this, such as, what about endangered species? Wouldn't they all die out under the market if the government didn't come in and protect the bald eagle? Or, what about air pollution? What about homeless people? So I take on sort of fun public policy questions and give quick, in my opinion, very pure free market analysis for that stuff. So as far as the space program being run by the government, I say, look, the first thing to realize is there's nothing magical about government employment per se. Right? So the people who work for NASA, let's take the Apollo missions. That's a good one. It's not that those engineers and physicists and others who worked for NASA suddenly knew more information or were better scientists because they were getting their paychecks from the government. All right. So if we could imagine a private employer hiring those people, I mean, in principle, a private firm could have sent spacecraft to the moon to plant an American flag, right? It's not that there's anything in terms of the laws of physics or the realities of engineering that meant, oh, this has to be a government operation. However, no private enterprise would have spent billions of dollars in the 60s to put an American flag on the moon and get some rocks and whatever else they did, and to jump around and take a picture of it or take a video of it. That, you would say, just like Mitt Romney saying to Newt Gingrich, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, if some executive came up to me and said he wanted to spend billions of dollars colonizing the moon, I would say you're fired, right? So if that really doesn't make sense to do right now, it certainly didn't make sense to do it back in the 1960s when it was a lot more expensive and people weren't as wealthy. So, the Apollo, when somebody says without NASA there would have been no Apollo mission, I would say right, and that's a good thing. The Apollo mission was incredibly wasteful. And that sounds, like a stick your head in the sand and so unromantic and, oh, you don't like space. No, I'm a total sci-fi geek, right? I used to, in high school, I'd watch Star Trek instead of talking to girls, just like probably every other libertarian guy. So it's not that I'm against space exploration, it's that I am for economic efficiency, and the resources that went into sending a ship to the moon back then, that was a complete well, not a complete waste of resources. I mean, it was, other things equal. That's cool that they put a flag on the moon and did some genuine scientific research, I'm sure. But the point is that was way too expensive. The benefits were totally swamped by the costs. So there's now, in terms of economic theory, the only way you can justify government involvement in space exploration or other types of funding for science is that you say it has positive externalities, that there's spillover effects, and so in other words, there are certain lines of research, like building a super collider or something. You could say that is going to just shower all sorts of even narrowly economic benefits on humanity over the next 50 years from learning about the constituents of the atom and so on, or the various types of atoms and whatever. But it wouldn't pay for any firm to do it because they wouldn't be able to capture all of those benefits, right? It's not like they would be able to sell products and reap the tens of billions of dollars in gains that this new knowledge is showering on humanity. And so, like, you could argue, and economists have argued, that that's the way to justify it, that the market would insufficiently invest in these lines because of this positive externality. So for that, I mean, with all that market failure literature, it's typically showing what that stuff really showing is we can logically imagine that the free market isn't the best of all possible institutions. And sure, that's true. But from that, it doesn't follow. And therefore, the real government in the real world ought to take whatever, hundreds of billions of dollars from taxpayers at gunpoint and spend it on those things. That doesn't follow at all. So, and I think, and just to take a few examples, like look at the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. For those of you who are familiar with that, I know about it because I was a big fan of Richard Feynman, and he was one of the people that was on the commission appointed by President Reagan to look into it. And if you know the story, it's because it was too cold when they launched, and the O-rings, I forget the exact details, but when it's too cold, the O-rings were like real brittle, like they didn't expand or something like that. And so that's ultimately what led to, I guess, the leak of the fuel came out, and then the fuel tanks blew up when the thing was taken off. So it's not merely that they screwed up, and then when Feynman was going in and investigating and talking to the engineers and stuff, I mean, it wasn't just like it was an honest screw up. It was that the lower level people were warning the higher ups at NASA, this is dangerous. This isn't safe. We need to not postpone the launch, or in general we need to have a different procedure. But yet the estimates for that type of failure were astronomically small. And Feynman said he was looking at the numbers and he realized whoever came up with the estimates, they had been picking the estimates for each component of like the list of things that would have to happen, such that the string of them together was the number that they knew they wanted to have in order to justify the program. Right? So he could tell they sort of worked backwards. They knew what they wanted the answer to be, and then that's how they fudged the numbers. And a lot of stuff, it was like the numbers, it was kind of arbitrary, so it wasn't like they were lying. It was just he could tell that the way the institution was set up, the higher ups wanted this mission to go forward, and they didn't want to have to scrap the shuttle program or delay it for too long of a time, and so they just set the incentives up right such that that was what happened, right? So things like, and then after the fact, the commission gave it a whitewashed the inquiry, and it wasn't like a bunch of people got fired or anything, and NASA's budget certainly didn't get chopped in half because they killed a bunch of people for no good reason and wasted $1 billion or whatever they did. That's not what happened, right? So what I'm saying is all of the inefficiency and corruption and failure to respond correctly after there's a massive scandal, all those things that we see in all the other areas of government are true when it comes to scientific exploits as well. And so I think all things considered, it would make far more sense for the government to not spend on these things and lower taxes and return those resources to the private sector. And yeah, it's true, there might be less total money spent ostensibly on space exploration the year after the government did that, but I think even the smaller amount that was spent would be spent far more effectively. And so in terms of the actual advancement of space exploration, I think especially the longer the time frame you give it, the better it would be. So let me put it to you this way. If all the governments around the world stopped their spending right now on space exploration and then cut their taxes accordingly, right? So it's not that they could just spend the money on something else. They would have to return those resources to the private sector. I think there would be a moon base earlier than if they went on their current course. And I think there would be, things colonizing factories and stuff on mineral-rich asteroids and stuff like that, I think would occur sooner the more that was relinquished to the private sector. Now, the development would be different. It would be more of a commercial development. So you wouldn't have necessarily new telescopes up there that could see distant quasars and things, you might have stuff like little joy rides given to millionaires. Whereas, maybe governments right now wouldn't spend a bunch of money developing ships that could go into low Earth orbit for a bunch of millionaires. Like, certainly the taxpayers wouldn't want to foot the bill for that, right? But space tourism would be an obvious thing to do in terms of private development while we're sort of learning the ropes. And how are they going to pay for that initially? Well, it's going to have to be wealthy people because the tickets for those kind of trips are going to be high in the beginning. So the course of the development would be much different if it were guided by profit and loss. But I think by any reasonable criterion of humanity conquering the solar system, it would be much quicker if we left that to the private sector. Okay. Anxious Alpaca says, do you think that the Krugman debate will ever happen realistically? You've gathered much money, but still no response. Well, that's a good question. A lot of people ask about that. So the last I checked, for those who don't know, if you go to krugmandebate.com, you can see what this person's referring to. So I have a public challenge to Paul Krugman where people are using, what is it? It's not Groupon. It's the thing that Groupon was a spinoff from. thepoint.com. So anyway, if you're familiar with how Groupon works, this thing called The Point was actually the original thing, and Groupon was a spinoff of it, where people make conditional pledges. So you put up a bunch of money, but your credit card doesn't get dinged until the thing happens. So as of this point, last I checked, I had like 77,000 pledged from various people saying if Krugman would ever debate me on business cycle theory, that amount of money would get donated to this food bank in New York City. And I checked with the food bank people and told them I was going to say, is that fine if I do that, or are you going to, sort of poo-poo that? And they said, no, that's fine. They want the money. So would it ever happen? Well, if it ever got over 100,000, let me not think if. When it gets over 100,000, I'm going to go back to those food bank people and say, hey, can you do a press release or something, just apprise them of the situation, to say there's literally $100,000 here just waiting to be written in a check to you. If this economist who lives in New York, well, I guess he doesn't live in New York. Where does he live? In New Jersey? Lives near New York, let's say, but writes for the New York Times. If he would just debate me, so can you issue a press release or something telling him, go kick this guy's butt? So that's what I do. And so how is that going to happen? Because it's sort of stalled. It's been at 77,000 for a while now. I need to make more videos. All right. So because I think there's plenty of people who they're lazy and they think it's not going to work, and so they're not taking out their credit card to type it in to make the conditional. Actually, yeah, you do have to put your credit card information in. It's just it doesn't get hit until the thing happens. So I think there's probably lots of people who actually who would pledge money if they thought it was going to happen. It's just they don't think it would happen, so they don't even bother doing the conditional pledge. So anyway, I have a few sort of funny video ideas in mind, like cliffhangers, if you will. In other words, I'm trying to think of ways that I can get people to pledge money and that there's a payoff even if Krugman doesn't debate me, right? So I'll make one YouTube video that has a cliffhanger, and then saying, if you donate, if the donated amount goes up to X amount, then I'll release part 2 of the video, that kind of stuff. So I have a few ideas of stuff. It's just I've been real busy with my actual job lately, and so I can't be taking the time and the money it takes to make these goofy videos. So that's really the main hindrance there. Somebody says, also, have you ever actually talked to Krugman by phone or anything besides blog posts? No. Nope. I have once or twice sent him an email, not about the debate, but just other things. And no, he's never answered me. I don't see somebody asking me this, but it's a frequent question that I hear, so let me just say the answer. Um, I have people have told me that they've asked Krugman face to face, like at a economics conference or something. Hey, what's the story with this Bob Murphy guy? You had any plans on debating him? And apparently Krugman's answer was, well, if he had come to me through back channels, I would have considered it. But the fact that he did this sort of public stunt, no, I can't possibly debate him now because then that would set a precedent, and then everybody would want to debate me. So no. So if that is indeed what he said, I don't know that that's what he said, but that's what people told me. My response is twofold. Well, first of all, that's sort of duplicitous because the whole reason I'm doing the publicity stunt is that Krugman said beforehand that he would never debate an Austrian. Right? There was a girl, I forget her name. She went to a book signing that Krugman was doing, like at a Barnes and Noble or something. He had some book that was coming out, probably the reissue of his Depression Economics, and the way she tells the story, it's the Q&A period, and she raised her hand and said, "Hey, would you ever, or why don't you debate an Austrian economist on the Austrian business cycle theory, something like that?" And she says that his answer in front of this crowd was, "Look, you're going to think I'm being an elitist jerk here, but it's not worth my time to debate those guys. The serious mainstream economists don't entertain the Austrian theory. They think it's obsolete and discredited. And frankly, I don't want to give a platform to those people. Why would I debate them?" Or he said something along those lines. So that is what made me, in the back of my mind, start musing with what could I do to sort of force Krugman to debate me, and that's when I hit on the idea, this sort of goofy publicity stunt of me trying to get money to donate to a food bank. So he's in the awkward position of not debating me when it would send whatever the number is, $77,000 to a food bank in New York. The other response is so again, what Krugman is saying is, well, no, if I debate this Murphy guy, then everyone's going to want to follow suit, and then I would look like I was playing favorites or something, or I was being inconsistent. Okay, but I'm not just some random guy who's saying, "Hey, I want you to debate me," because plenty of people have said that. I'm saying, if you debate me, and look, I've raised at this point $77,000 for a food bank in New York. So you'd think Krugman. So if he's saying, well, no, because if I debated this guy, well, then who knows how many people would come out of the woodwork with $77,000 that would get donated to a food bank that I would have to debate. Imagine how many people would want me to give up an hour of my time for $77,000 going to food bank in New York. You kidding me? You see what I'm saying? So you would think that would be a good thing for him. So I suspect it's just he doesn't want to debate an Austrian, period. And so back when it was a hypothetical sort of friendly invitation, he said no because they're not serious. And then when it was this awkward, thing with a bunch of money on it, he said, "Oh no, because if I did that, then it would set a precedent." So I don't. Incidentally, people say, "Oh, you think he's afraid of you?" It's not that he's afraid that he thinks really he's wrong, and he's afraid that I'm gonna show the world how wrong he is. I think probably. I mean, I don't want to sound too arrogant here. I mean, I'm not stupid, and people, if you watch me debate people when I really am debating them, I mean, I don't just I mean, I come up with stuff that at least superficially sounds like a good argument. So I mean, if he knows who I am at all, and I don't know that he does. I mean, I don't. In the grand scheme of things, I'm probably a punk to him. But I mean, if he ever did look into it just to see, well, what would happen if I debated this guy? I mean, I would like to think he would realize I could hold my own and that I could certainly fool the average person. So he might be afraid to debate me in the sense that it might look to the untrained observer, especially to the average Tea Party guy, that I crushed him. Right? So it's not that I think Krugman might be afraid that I would actually beat him if there were a fair referee, but I could see him thinking, I don't want to give an audience to this guy because then the Austrians are going to take the YouTube of our debate and just pass it around forever, saying, "Oh, Krugman got crushed. Look at the 15-minute mark of this video when Krugman admitted that Martians coming would stimulate aggregate demand, and oh my gosh, what an idiot." You see what I'm saying? So I can see him thinking that. Just like there are, like let's say the evolution debate, that there are a lot of Christian guys who are real lawyerly and real persuasive, whatever, and real glib, and then there are also guys, so you could see like a biologist or something from some top university might not want to debate somebody like that, even if the biologist thinks that, oh my gosh, the case for the standard account of the origin and development of life on Earth has so much overwhelming evidence on its side. It's not even an issue anymore. It shouldn't even be up for debate. But you could see how somebody like that would be afraid to debate this real dashing, glib Christian guy who believed in the literal truth of Genesis, right? So I imagine Krugman might be like that, where he has nothing to gain by debating me, and he could lose something, right? So in terms of, I think Hans Hoppe said about, I was at a conference with him once, and some student came up, and Hoppe standing right next to me, and the student came up and said, Dr. Murphy, will Krugman ever debate you? And I gave him my sort of stock answer, and Hoppe just like said, of course he won't. And he looked at me and he said, would you debate you? I'm not doing a good Hoppe impression, but in Hoppe's mind, it was inconceivable that Krugman would debate me, just because why would he? That would be stupid for him to do it. That if he beats me, so what? He's a Nobel laureate, and I'm some punk who doesn't even have an academic post anywhere. Doesn't mean anything. But if I happen to put on a better show than he did, well, that would be embarrassing, right? So there's no, it's all downside for him. Having said all that, would it ever happen? I think it would, if I could get the numbers up. And I was thinking, if I could get somebody to host it, like a, let's say, I'm not. It's not that I've broached this with anybody, but I'm saying, for example, let's say Mark Skousen, I gave him advance notice and said, okay, at the next Freedom Fest in Vegas, what if I debated Paul Krugman? And so you could tout that, on your thing to get to advertise and get more people to come and pay, and so then maybe Skousen could rack in and say, well, gee, how much more would I take in at the gate if I had this as one of the main events? And then, he could figure out how much he could pay Paul Krugman to do it. Because the thing is, I imagine Krugman would do it if he personally is going to get a big check, right? Because the way I framed it, it was more like of a shaming thing where Krugman wasn't getting paid; it was to a food bank. So I can't alter the details of that, because that's the way the thing is set up contractually with the point. But I'm saying, as a side deal, if somebody is paying Krugman to debate me, and I'm just trying to think of how could that happen. And I was like, well, if we had the debate live somewhere where there was a live audience and those people had paid to get in, that's one way it could happen. All right, but again, this is all speculation. But I'm just, since you're asking me, I've certainly daydreamed about these things, and I came up with that solution, that if Krugman was going to personally get a big check from doing it, then I could see it happening. Okay, P. Carrier says in 2000, and we got about 5 minutes or so left, so I'm going to just try to knock out some more questions quickly. In 2006, you co-wrote an article with Gene Callahan for the JLS critiquing Hoppe's argumentation ethics. As far as you know, have any of the argumentation ethics proponents ever answered the critique? I don't think Hoppe has ever publicly responded to it. Stephan Kinsella has. I don't know if he's responded to the JLS version, but Gene and I wrote sort of an antecedent thing on, I think it was on antistate.com. I think that's where it was. Which had basically the same arguments, as we kind of dressed it up and put in citations and stuff for the JLS piece. And for sure, Kinsella responded to that one. I don't. So yes, he answered us, but I don't think he really did anything. So, I know that sounds like I'm being a jerk or something, but I we had. I didn't see him ever directly taking what our argument was and saying that's a bad argument because of the. I just saw Kinsella sort of restating what Hoppe's position was, and like, yeah, I know that's what his position is, and I'm saying it doesn't make sense for these three independent reasons. So for you to show me why I'm wrong, you have to take each reason and answer it. So, just for example, one of our points was to say, what if an animal rights, okay, that's the 1 hour warning. What if an animal rights activist said, aha, yeah, see, so anybody who denies that horses have rights and therefore we can't enslave horses, that would be immoral to do so. I mean, anybody who tried to say, I deny horses the right of self-ownership is engaged in contradiction, right? What if an animal rights activist says that? Clearly, Hoppe and Stephan Kinsella don't think that's a good argument, so then what do they say? And it's going to necessarily involve something like, well, a horse. I mean, well, I don't care what they say. My point is, whatever they do say to make it so that Hoppe's argument doesn't prove that horses own themselves, well, then I can say that about severely retarded humans or about fetuses or about, I don't know because I'm not sure exactly how they would get out of it, but whatever they say, I claim I could apply that to particular human beings that they do want to say this argument applies to. And so then we get to the point where you have to define, well, what's the class of rights-bearing being to which this argument applies, and there you're bringing all sorts of back. You're basically there having to assume that all humans have the same rights, and then how do we come up with the content of those rights? Oh, in this particular argument, which is fine, but it's I think they believed they were doing something a lot more fundamental than that. I think they didn't realize they were sort of smuggling in the background assumption that there's these things called rights that all humans possess, but not non-humans, and now we're going to just try to figure out what should those rights be. And that's a much weaker claim than what they seem to be saying, is just that once you grasp the nature of argumentation per se, you realize you would be contradicting yourself if you denied the libertarian ethic. And I think that no, they have not proven that at all. And I just said the one argument for it, and there's other ones, but I don't remember Stephan or anybody else taking that argument on in a satisfactory way. I mean, maybe he did address it, but I don't remember him saying, this is why the animal rights activists can't use the argument, but whatever I just said for that wouldn't therefore knock the argument out for particular types of human beings. So just to make sure you guys aren't getting lost, if Hoppe or Kinsella says, oh, well, that's silly because horses can't engage in the argumentation, well, then okay, but then that means mentally retarded people don't own themselves, or infants don't own themselves because they can't engage in argumentation either, right? So, or somebody who's asleep, so you can say, oh, well, no, I mean somebody who could engage in the argument if you gave them 24 hours to get ready. Okay, somebody in a coma. You see what I'm saying? So it's, it gets very ad hoc very quickly when they thought they had this sweeping, just thinking through first principles, look at the power of this, and we're saying, no, you don't mean that. Or another example would be, we'd say, okay, let's assume that they've proven that you can't rightfully, that you're contradicting yourself if you would deny someone the ability to engage in logical argumentation. Okay, and so therefore he owns himself because you need to own your body in order to argue. So I claim that you just proved everyone has to own some land, because you can't carry on an argument unless you're standing on a piece of land, right? You can't just be floating in space. So therefore, Hoppe just proved every human being, by the nature of argumentation per se, is entitled to own at least enough land to stand on, and actually enough land to grow food. And you say, well, no, because you could just buy the food from somebody else. Okay, well, then why do you have to own your body? Somebody else could be your master, and you could be his slave, and then you could just say, I'm going to pick extra cotton next week because I want to then have you give me permission to go debate somebody over libertarianism, right? And so if you think that's absurd, well, then why do you think it's okay to say I don't need to own the ground I'm standing on? You say, oh, well, no, but you could just get permission from the guy who owns the stage to stand on it during the debate. Well, you see what I'm saying? Now we're getting into empirical, practical questions, whereas before, this argument was touted as this majestic thing of, pure logic almost, when we can see that in practice, if anything, it's a very empirical argument where you have to kind of use your judgment as to how markets work. So anyway, whatever you think of those two examples I gave you, I haven't seen Stefan or anybody else take those on and show why they're bad and why Hoppe's argument still works. I just basically remember Stefan kind of restating what Hoppe's position was. Okay, I guess just one more, and I apologize. I took probably too long on some of these earlier ones, but in any event, I do think I should keep the whole thing short. Okay, Saman101 says, "Hi Bob, huge fan of the Austrian school. Talking to a monetarist, he claimed that the housing bubble was not actually a result of the Federal Reserve holding interest rates down too low for too long, because the money supply during that period did not increase at nearly a fast enough rate. He then claimed that Asian capital was funneled by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into the housing sector here in the U.S. This, and not the manipulation of interest rates, was the reason why the housing bubble occurred." Again, this is according to some monetarists that this guy was talking to. Okay, couple things. It is true that if you just look at like the growth in the monetary base, or M1 and M2, during the period where Austrians say Alan Greenspan fueled this massive housing bubble, it is true that those charts aren't through the roof. So, just to be honest, when I make the case that Alan Greenspan fueled the housing bubble, it would have been convenient if the charts looked better. So I'll say that. But at the same time, the charts look basically as good as they do during the 70s. So what I will say is, if you don't think that what Greenspan did could possibly have been very inflationary and could have generated a housing bubble, well, then you also shouldn't say the Fed is responsible for the inflation, the price inflation of the 70s. You have to blame it on something else, because what the Fed did in the 70s wasn't qualitatively worse than what they did from 98 to 2005. So, like I say, it's true. Before I looked at the data, I would have guessed it would look more pronounced as to what happened during the housing bubble years. But by the same token, I would have thought it'd be more pronounced what happened in the 70s. So either I'm wrong on both counts, which is possible, or it's just not a little bit, but what seems to be a modest amount of Fed expansion can actually have a huge impact. Okay, as far as let me just say one other thing about that. If you go to my Mises.org archives, I have several pieces showing various charts and so on, trying to spell out the Austrian story, and it does kind of work. All right, so when Greenspan lowered the federal funds rate from, what was it, in 2000 down to June of 2003, he brought it from like 6.5% down to 1%, and then held it there for a year. And then from June 2004 onward, they started just like, it looked like a staircase, raising it back up. If you look at the monetary base superimposed in that chart, it does do what it should. In other words, the base starts shooting up when the interest rates are dropping, and then the base, I don't think it shrinks, but like the growth tapers off when the growth starts again, when the rate goes up again. So that does kind of fit the general textbook story of when the Fed wants to cut interest rates, it expands its asset purchases and so on, and then when it wants to raise interest rates, it either slows its purchases or actually sells. So that general story still works. And then also too, you can look at housing prices, and housing prices were rising, and then they kind of peaked and started coming down basically the same time when the Fed started raising interest rates. It's not perfect to the week or anything, but the basic story fits. It's not like we're having to really bend the facts to make the story work. In contrast, people who say, "Oh, this was all about Asians saving," I think they really do have to bend the facts. That, and so specifically, I have an article at Mises.org called, I think it's called, "Is the Fed or Asian Saving to Blame for the Housing Bubble?" Something like that. And I mean, I just go through and show that, I mean, just on the surface of it, that's kind of weird to say the reason we have the second worst economic calamity in world history is because those Asians were saving too much. That's kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? If you believe in the market and the virtue of thrift and so on. And so, what I show is that the rate, the global savings rate, if you try to relate that to the housing bubble or things like it, it doesn't really work. That the world as a whole, I don't know if it was Asian nations, they saved more at a time for a while. I don't remember the exact dates, but it's not like there was an unprecedented amount of Asian saving when the housing bubble occurred. That the rate of income that they were saving was lower then than it had been 10 years earlier. And it's not that their rate all of a sudden went up or went down, I should say, and that's what caused the bubble to burst, right? So, in other words, if you're blaming the housing bubble on the fact that those Asians were saving too much and sending us too much of their savings, well, then to explain, well, why did the housing bubble burst? You would think it's because, all of a sudden then the Asians saved less, and so they weren't sending us as much of their capital, and so then interest rates had to go up. But that's not what you see. That I'm pretty sure that they were saving even more, or at least the same amount. So it's a little bit weird. If you're trying to explain something that pumped up the bubble and then made it collapse, it would be nice if the cause was there when the thing was going up and then was taken away when it collapsed. Which it is true in the Austrian story. We can, like I said, I can show you how the bubble was getting blown up when interest rates were going down, but then when interest rates started coming up, that's when the bubble burst. So at least my story can explain both ends of the thing, whereas the Asian savings story doesn't really explain it. And the other virtue of the Austrian story is interest rates were at historic lows at the peak of the bubble, right? Whereas with the Asian savings story, like I said, it's not like during this massive bubble, Asian savings was at an all-time high. That no, the Asian savings had been higher like a decade earlier when there wasn't this massive bubble as much, all right? So anyway, don't quote me on the exact timing and all that, but if you go and look at my article, I'm much more precise there. I don't remember the exact details right now off the top of my head. Okay, well, let me stop there. Thanks, everyone, for sending your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to more of them, but like I say, I think in the grand scheme, it's better if I keep this thing relatively short.